Oh no! Low oil pressure? Is it time to panic? Or should we just critically think about it? Does it sound like this? If so, yes, it's time to panic. But if it's quiet and there's no noise, stop. Check your dipstick. If it shows full, there's no need to panic. If it shows low, fill it up and look for leaks. If it shows full, you still could have a supply problem, but don't panic yet. Try this first. So today we're looking at a 2011 F150, and it's got about 212,000 miles. Now look at the coolant temperature sensor. We're at normal operating temperature and the RPM is showing that we're at idle. The warning light is on and the low oil pressure gauge is low. But watch this. Suddenly, the pressure gauge goes up and the warning light disappeared. According to the RPM gauge, we're above idle. We're actually moving up to about 2,500 RPM. We're not moving, there's no speed, so we're sitting here not moving, but the engine is running and the idle is up. Now watch as we go back to idle. We get down to about 700-800 RPM. The oil pressure gauge drops to zero and the low oil pressure warning light comes back on. Now we raise our idle again. The gauge shows that pressure came up and the warning light disappeared. So what's going on here? So let's just sit here and watch this for a minute as this cycle repeats. Hopefully you can hear the engine in the background when we go above idle. But watch your gauges. You can see the RPM, the speed, the coolant temperature doesn't change, and the oil pressure does fluctuate. But I got a question for you. Should oil pressure, if it is really low, should it drop that suddenly? I mean, we're going from normal to nothing. And should it recover that quick? Before you answer, first consider this. An idling engine doesn't require as much pressure to keep all of its moving parts lubricated as one that's running at a much higher rate of speed. Typically, every 1,000 RPM requires 10 psi. Now back to my question. Should oil pressure drop that suddenly, and should it recover that quickly? Of course, there are different types of pumps. However, each type of pump pushes oil through the engine's oil filter and then up through the motor to the top, where it eventually drips back down again to the oil pan. No, oil is a liquid, so we're talking about hydraulic pressure. It is a rotating device that responds to the speed of its rotation, so any change should not be sudden. So why do we have a sudden change? So since it can't be hydraulic, could it be electrical? In this next part, I'm going to use my scanner. Now you don't often think about using a scanner to help you diagnose a low oil pressure problem. But let's take a look. Now you know with the scanners we can choose lots of different PIDs. But let's take a look at this while we try and duplicate the problem with the gauge and the warning light. The graph on the left is the low pressure light indicator. It's either on or off. And the one on the right is the pressure percentage. Note how they both change at the same time and they correspond to the gauge and the low pressure light indicator. As we go back to idle, you'll see the RPM fall, hear the engine wind down, and then suddenly both of the gauges light back up. So let's run through this again so that you can see it happening. Bring the RPM up, you can hear the engine rev, and your signals change. The RPM goes down, and the signals change suddenly. Now it's the repetition of this that confirms this being an electrical issue. Bring the RPM up, you'll get a sudden engine change, or even higher to around 3,000 RPM. And then you come back down and you get that sudden change again. Okay, so let's let's read the electrical diagram. Sometimes reading a diagram can give us answers that we didn't even know we should ask. The switch is at the bottom of the page, and you can see that at rest it is normally open. Then when it closes, it completes the path to ground, and the ground now reports directly to the PCM. There is a path to the left, but it is not used. In position 2, it indicates a normal level, and in position 1, it indicates low pressure, even though this is not really a pressure reading. It is simply an open or closed switch. Closed sends ground, open does not. So in position 2, it's closed, sending ground indicating a normal level. The PCM sees the ground and commands the oil pressure warning light on. And at the same time, the PCM completes the circuit to the gauge, and it responds at the same time. So what closes that switch? This is an oil pressure switch. It screws into the oil gallery so that it has access to the oil pressure, and it's a one-wire connector. The switches are normally closed, like the one on the left. This is why the warning light illuminates when the ignition is first turned on and goes out after the engine starts and oil pressure begins to rise, like the one on the right. As that pressure rises, oil fills that chamber against the diaphragm inside and opens the switch, and therefore turns out the light. Now we're using a little bit of light here to shine inside that connector so that you can see that there's oil inside there. That oil shouldn't be there. Now when this thing is screwed into the engine, oil goes through that hole, and there's a diaphragm inside the cylinder, and that's how the oil comes out the other end on the electrical side. So one of the clues that this thing was bad is it was covered with oil. Now according to the service manual, there's two switches. One is a low oil level switch, and the other one is an oil pressure switch, and they're both down at the bottom. Now look at this highlighted area. You'll see that it's actually located behind the alternator. So here's a look actually in the engine. You see the alternator down there, so this is going to be kind of hard to get to. It's really buried back behind it, and you can't even get to it over the front wheel going into the wheel well. It's just too crowded. The alternator has got to come out. As with any job, there's a few things you have to take off. You have to take off your air breather, take the air filter out, and then you have the duct work. You don't have to take this completely off. Just take it off of the throttle intake and then push it out of the way. But the big thing is your alternator's down there. You can see it, but you have to take the belt tensioner off. You could try and mess around getting around it, but I find it a whole lot easier if you just take the belt tensioner off, and then you can get right to the bolts that hold the alternator on. So there it is. There's our oil pressure sensor, and you can see it's filled with oil, so the diaphragm has ruptured. Now if you look close at this picture, you'll see the bolt holes to the left is where the alternator bolts on. So this sensor is actually buried completely behind the alternator. You really can't even hardly see it. So you're going to have to take the alternator off to be able to get any kind of tools on this to be able to take that sensor out. So when faced with any problem, don't panic. Apply your critical thinking.